Good afternoon, and welcome to this amazing conversation this afternoon. Amazing, I say that in advance because I know it will be so, with Asha Dahya, our special guest for today. I welcome you to another Learning Center webinar. My name is Carrie Jackson. I'm director of spiritual, oh my gosh, what is my title? It's been a long day. Spiritual care and activism. So I'm glad to have you here with us today. Even though we are not able to see you and hear you, please do let us know you're here right in the chat and say hi to us. So I'm going to let you know we have some exciting online courses for you in the Religion and Repro Learning Center. Right now, we have over, about 40 or 50 classes, and we have quite a few more on the way. Our classes, our online classes are available for free through the end of this month. And then in April, we will start charging a modest fee, but please take advantage of having opportunity to get some of the free courses. Today, Asha Dahya and I will be engaged in a rich conversation about her documentary film that is coming out very soon. And we want to have you engage with us in conversation as well. So the last 15 minutes or so of our hour, you will have opportunity to ask questions. And throughout our time together today, feel free to use the Q&A box that should be at the bottom of your screen for you to write questions that you have. And then if you see someone who raises a question, you said, I want to know that, you have the opportunity to upvote that question. And we will especially get to the questions that have more votes. But we will take note of all of the questions that are raised because we know that all of the questions are important and they may guide us in some future conversations that we have. So greetings to all of you. Let me introduce our speaker, and then we're going to launch into what I know will be a rich conversation. Asha Dahya is an author, speaker, and founder of girltalkhq.com. Asha was born in the UK, raised in Australia, and now lives in Los Angeles. She has spent the last 16 years creating, producing, and hosting content for networks such as MTV, MSN, Disney, ABC, Nickelodeon, Fox, and on and on and on in the US and in Australia. Asha is considered a voice of authority in the feminist media space and has delivered keynote addresses for organizations such as Accenture, UCLA, and March for Moms. She has moderated panels for UN Women, Mount St. Mary's University, where a friend of mine is a professor, Empower Institute, and so many other organizations. She is the author of Today's Wonder Women, a collection of stories and essays and interviews that celebrate superpower, love, determination, vision, and so much more of amazing women. Asha is the recipient of the Awesome Without Borders grant from the Harnish Foundation and the 2022 Creative Power Award grant. She is passionate about empowering women, girls, and femmes to take up space and raise their voices and share their stories in the world. And she is producer of the upcoming documentary that we will be discussing today, Someone You Know. And we are delighted that Asha is also one of the board members of the Religious Coalition for Reproductive Choice. Asha, I welcome you to this conversation today.
Thank you, Carrie, for having me. I'm really honored to be speaking with you. You're one of my all-time favorite people. And I'm not just saying that because you're in front of me virtually. I really value the work that you're doing. And yeah, thankful to be here today.
Thank you. Thank you. So I'm going to jump in with the questions.
Do it.
But remember, audience, please remember we want to hear your questions too. So here's my first question. What inspired you to produce this documentary? And what does the title, Someone You Know, mean to you?
Yeah, great questions. I'll get to the title in a minute, but first I'll talk about how I came to be on the project. So originally in 2020, I was asked to produce this documentary with another production company. So it was their idea. They wanted to make a short film specifically focusing on stories of later abortion. And the original intent was to release it before the 2020 election, push back on a lot of the, really ugly rhetoric that happens in political debates around election time. So I worked on it with a director, a good friend of mine named Sarah Moshman, and we filmed all the interviews and it was really great. And then we didn't end up getting to the edit stage and being able to release it in time for the election. And the production company by that point had also taken on a number of different projects, and they decided that they didn't have the bandwidth to make this film. And it was really disappointing because it's a topic that I care about. So then the owner of the company came to me and said, "Hey, do you want the footage? Do you want to make this film?" And I was like, "Yes, please give me it all." So he gave me all the footage. He actually gave me the equipment that we filmed it on and said, "It's yours."
Wow.
So that's, I guess I quote unquote inherited the film, but I'd already worked on it and had a lot of, personal and emotional investment in it. So I began working on it by myself at the beginning of 2021. And really now it was a blank slate for me. It was, when do I want to release it? What are the messages that I really want to share, knowing the stories that were shared in these interviews? And so we didn't have a title originally when I was working with the original company. And so that was another thing that I got to come up with, and listening to these interviews over and over and over again. And, as a filmmaker, you really tried to hear, okay, what are these phrases that keep coming up? What are the words that are the common threads among the three stories that we profiled and the two, there was an activist and a medical expert that we also interviewed. And so the title, Someone You Know, really is a way of bringing back the idea that someone who gets a later abortion could be, and most likely is, someone you know. Because when you look at the data that says 1 in 4 women in America will have an abortion before the age of 45. And I use women as the inclusive term, but women is the term that is used in a lot of, peer-reviewed studies and data. Mm-hmm. That means that we all know and love someone who has had an abortion. So when it comes to later abortion, which are still a very small percentage, they are still part of that population, that it is someone that we know. And I really want to bring that back, keep that in the back of people's minds when they're listening to these stories, because it really just reiterates that we need to think about this and approach the issue of later abortion differently, and put the idea that it is someone that we know in front and center, as opposed to political debates or religious sensibilities. These are real people, real humans with real stories. So I guess in a nutshell, that's what the title means, and how it came about.
Wonderful, thank you. So my next question, what do you hope this film will add to the important conversations about abortion care and overall reproductive dignity? So not only the abortion aspect of it, but reproductive dignity writ large.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it's more urgent than ever right now. I feel like I've been saying that for the last few years when talking about abortion, but really I think people now really understand what the stakes are with Roe versus Wade on the precipice of being overturned. I really want people to see that when we debate abortion in media or online or in politics, what really gets left out in a lot of ways, not in every way, but in a lot of ways, are the everyday lives that are impacted by our decisions and our opinions and our attitudes toward it. And really understand that when you see the stories of these three women, Valerie, Sharon, and Mindy, these stories are not black and white. They are very complex. They are very nuanced. These women themselves have layered lives. They're full of so many different things, and they don't approach these decisions with necessarily any simplicity, especially when it comes to later abortion. They are often very hard decisions to make. And so I want people to think about that. And specifically when I want people to think about that, I really want to encourage people who consider themselves pro-choice, because I realize that for my target audience, I don't necessarily want to target those who are completely against abortion. I feel like that is not my wheelhouse. For other people, it may be. This film really is about engaging the majority of Americans who consider themselves pro-choice, but in a lot of ways, later abortion has been that murky gray area that may be too sensitive or too uncomfortable, and to really think about, well, what does reproductive dignity mean, and why shouldn't you include later abortion in that? And so through these stories, I hope people understand that dignity means a person going to a hospital and being able, or to her clinic or to a doctor, and being able to say, this is a heartbreaking and hard decision for me, but I know I've got all the access that I need, as opposed to, oh, we're not going to give you the care that you need in this really pressing, urgent time, because this is a Catholic hospital and we don't unfortunately do that unless you're literally about to die. And even then, we still might not do that. And when you do, you have to pay thousands and thousands of dollars, because that's what these women went through in the film. So reproductive dignity really is, putting yourself in these women's shoes and seeing what would you want if you were in that position. And we would want the freedom, the dignity, and the support to make the right decisions for our lives and for the people that we love.
I love it. I love it. So you did this amazing TED Talk. I'm using the word amazing a lot today.
I feel honored.
And so anyone who has not seen that, check out that TED Talk that Asha did. Was it about 2 years or so ago you did it?
I did it in 2018, and it went up online 2019. And you can just find it on my website, ashadahya.com, if you don't want to search through YouTube.
So in that TED Talk, you mentioned some women who were members of your former church who had been adamant anti-abortion, some even who had participated in anti-abortion protest, who then later had abortions. So I really want to hear from you. What were some of the things you believe they had to push through? Because there's a lot of shaming that happens in many Christian churches in particular, and conservative Christian churches more specifically. So lots of shaming. And how do you feel that impacted their lives? What were the things they had to push through? And did any of that also show up in your film, Someone You Know, that whole issue of shaming?
Yeah, shame is such a powerful, a negatively powerful weapon that gets used in a lot of spaces. And myself, coming from the conservative Christian environment, which is the only one I can really speak to, shame was used a lot. It was interweaved into a lot of the lessons around sex, around gender roles, around purity culture, which is a lot of the messages, around body shaming, specifically toward women, but it also includes men and really puts a pressure on them around sex and gender as well. And of course, around birth control, around abortion, all of those things. And so it really gets weaponized in a lot of ways. And so for the women, I'm still finding out women from my former church who have had abortions because they write to me secretly, and only after I had started sharing articles on Facebook and publicly on social media. All of this I talk about in the TED Talk. And it kind of made me sit up for a minute thinking, why are you telling me this now just because I'm maybe expressing more progressive views and, you know, more liberal views on social media, but in public there would be the very, you know, anti-choice voices commenting on the things that I would share and, you know, trying to rebuke me. But I knew that there were these women sharing their stories with me. A couple of them I actually ended up interviewing on camera because they were willing to share their stories about how, because of the things that they had been through, whether it was unexpected pregnancy, whether it was sexual assault, whether it was toxic relationships, and really being shunned from the church, shamed for their choices, they really wanted to speak up because they knew that they weren't the only ones. And so them sharing their stories with me, it helped me learn. It wasn't really about me trying to confirm my bias. I really wanted to learn, like, what is happening behind the scenes of, you know, publicly you see one sort of expression of being anti-abortion, but then behind closed doors, it's completely different. So I'm really thankful to the women who did share their stories with me over the years as I've been doing different interviews and research and whatnot. In terms of in the film, shame definitely plays a role in each of the stories, but specifically in Sharon. She is originally from Honduras. She came to the US to study, and she ended up having a later abortion. Hers wasn't a medical necessity story. Hers was being pushed later and later into pregnancy because of the barriers in place, because of the state that she was in, because of the misinformation that was being thrown toward her from crisis pregnancy centers, otherwise known as colloquially as fake clinics. So that was really an important story to tell. And because she came from a very strict Catholic background, shame was a big part of that, you know, not just around abortion, but around having a boyfriend and talking about sex and sex education, and all of that is really a part of this shame narrative. And one thing that I also wanted to mention when I was, you know, thinking about this question is that, you know, it's really baffling that this is such a shameful issue, because there is a study that came out in 2015 from Lifeway Research, which is a Christian organization, and they wanted to study abortion and abortion trends. And they found that 7 in 10 women in America who get an abortion identify as Christian. And they wrote something really powerful in that study, which kind of sticks with me to this day. And I talked about it in my TED Talk. And they opened the report on the study that says many women with unplanned pregnancies go silently from the church pew to the abortion clinic, convinced the church would rather gossip rather than help. And I think that really sums up that idea of shame. It serves to silence and oppress. Someone else said that in the chat here. It really is a damaging weapon, a damaging tactic. And so the way that I feel the best way to push back on that is sharing stories, making films, having discussions like these.
Yeah. You know, the very first webinar that we did as part of the Learning Center was titled Pregnancy Shaming. And in that webinar, we had women, all of whom were Christian ministers. And we did this during this season of Advent leading up to Christmas, where people are, all these honorifics are given to the Virgin Mary and you know, all of that. And so it was in that context, we were talking about the ways in which body shaming happens, the ways in which women who struggle with infertility are shamed for not having children, or individuals who choose to have children in some unconventional way. You know, so just all of the kind of shaming that there is. And I want to give a thanks to Donna for sharing your story. Not Donna, I'm sorry, I'm saying the wrong name, Suzanne, for sharing your story about the shaming that was used within your country, and even to the point of being called a witch. And that is something so common as this weapon, to call someone a witch, to shame people in the varieties of ways. And we get to, by telling stories, as you're doing, get to help break that down and bring some truth. Now, it is the case that most of the major religions in the world have compassion as a core principle. And however, it is also the truth that many of the practitioners of those major religions in the world often do not practice compassion. Is there any way you hope from the film, as people talk about it, that we might help inspire compassion and move people away from the shaming?
Yeah, I think there are definitely ways that I hope this film will be used as a point of conversation in churches, in faith communities, in temples, and so on and so forth. And that's one of my plans, after the film is released, to do a series of impact screenings, discussions, because it's not just about watching a film and going away and forgetting about it. It's like, how do we then put our thoughts and our feelings into action, and how can we all be advocates wherever we are, no matter who we are? And so I haven't begun the outreach just yet because I'm still in post-production, but I think there are, one of the things I really want to see is more amplification of the progressive and pro-choice faith leaders who are being very vocal about their support for abortion access and abortion rights. And that is so encouraging to me. I mean, people like yourself, Kari, the RCRC CEO, Katie Z, she has been to an abortion clinic and was part of an interfaith blessing over a clinic when it opened. There are so many of those examples happening. She's talked about the clergy consultation service that happened pre-Roe versus Wade. And, it looks like there may be a version of that people are thinking about going forward if and when Roe versus Wade is overturned. So there really is a rich tradition and history of faith leaders and religious leaders supporting the right and the access to abortion and making sure that it's safe, and women they don't end up like Rosie Jimenez, who was one of the first victims that we know of the Hyde Amendment. And it's really that's an entirely preventable death, and it's really, really tragic. So I think highlighting those faith leaders who are standing up and speaking out and supporting people seeking abortion is really important. And then, using films and discussions as a way to bring up these conversations rather than keeping it in the silence, in the shadows, like many of the women from my former church, I think will help, and really allowing that nuance, that it's not just a political talking point or a slogan, it's a whole story with complexities and nuance and flaws and grace and joy and difficulties, and all of that is what needs to be discussed, not just this very tiny aspect that we often see.
Awesome. So Asha, I'm curious, and I'm sure many in our audience are curious. How did you, having grown up in a very conservative Christian context, come to the point of advocating for reproductive dignity? What was your journey? Because arguably there was not much in your context that supported you in coming to this place. So what in your own life story facilitated that?
Yeah, I love this question because honestly, there are some days where I'm still thinking like, why did I choose this? It's not like an easy topic like, oh, I'm going to advocate for abortion. Woohoo. Although I do feel like that now. I feel very honored to be in this space and be speaking as a filmmaker, making this film. But for me, coming from the conservative tradition, I was never overly political. I never thought about abortion. It was just, I called myself pro-life. That's what you did, and abortion's wrong, and abortion's murder. And sorry, trigger warning for people listening, because those are the things that we were taught to say. And there was no sort of think beyond that. What do those words mean? When you set that narrative, who are you talking to when you say those really shocking words? And it wasn't until I went through a divorce at the age of 29. And during that divorce, I decided to leave that church because the person that I was married to, he worked at the church, and I felt I needed distance. After distancing myself from the church, and finding new community here in Los Angeles. I would, associate with women in film, feminist groups, and just really started learning about life and issues, feminism from a whole new perspective other than the one that I was raised to believe. And one of the issues that kept kind of coming up was abortion and reproductive rights. And I realized that the way that the person that I was and the things that I believed were these more progressive and inclusive definitions and stances. And I remember thinking, oh, this is who I am. And yes, I am a feminist. And yes, I do want access to reproductive rights, and dignity means allowing people the choices to make these choices, these decisions for themselves. And so when I started sharing those views, especially on social media, I would get a lot of pushback. And it would hurt because a lot of these people were my friends that I spent so much time with. Some of them are really, really good friends. But then, as I mentioned before, getting these other women who would secretly write to me, I guess I could say that the issue kind of chose me. I put myself out there with my big loud mouth as I do, and now it kind of guided me into this place. And I remember it was 2015 when, I don't know if people are familiar with those undercover videos by an anti-choice organization. They reportedly filmed Planned Parenthood employees, and they were like, hey, we've got all this information that Planned Parenthood are, trigger warning, selling fetal parts and baby parts for profit. And it turned out that was all false. They got convicted in a Texas court in front of a jury. But regardless, when those videos came out, the narrative was set, and the conservative evangelical movement really latched onto that. And there were blog posts and videos and discussions and media headlines. And I really started doing a lot of research during that. And some of the things that really came out from that were issues, discussions like, okay, well, what happens if abortion is all overturned and no one is allowed to get abortion ever? What's going to happen with, these children that are born into a family or a life that they're not wanted? And what happens with women who die from childbirth because they weren't allowed to get the procedure that was medically necessary to save their lives? What do we do about all of that? What do we do about the women who are living paycheck to paycheck and already have children and cannot afford to have another, or perhaps are in an abusive relationship? When you look at the statistics that 60% of women who get abortions are already mothers, that already starts your mind thinking, okay, there are other issues connected to this. It's your financial status, your job stability, your family size. All of these things started playing on my mind. And so I really wanted to use my background as a filmmaker, my personal history in the conservative church, and try to marry the two and find a way to widen the conversation among the demographic that I wanted to target, and say that it's not just about abortion that happens in this tiny little vacuum over here by itself and no one ever hears about it except during elections. This is everyday life for people. There are so many things that go into these decisions, and that's what we need to see more of, rather than just abortion. It's reproductive dignity. It's who gets to choose the size of their family, who gets to have children, who gets to decide whether they don't want children, and where are the discussions about miscarriage and infertility. All of that is part of this discussion. So in a very long-winded way of saying, I guess the issue chose me. And now, being a mother of two, I think it's really cemented the idea that if anyone was in those rooms where I was giving birth, or in the doctor's office where I was making decisions about my body and my family, I mean, I cannot even fathom that. I was so privileged and lucky to have the healthcare that I did. And to think that there are people out there who don't is just, it's shameful. It really is shameful that we live in a country where this is happening. So that's why I'm doing what I do, and why we are where we are today.
Well, thank you so much for that. And so one of the things you talked about was disinformation. And of course, disinformation, misinformation and disinformation have been used as weapons across the century, maybe the millennia, as long as there have been people. And but of course, in this era that we have the telecommunications technologies that we have, the social media that we have, et cetera, how disinformation are being used has taken on a whole other level. And you spoke earlier about crisis pregnancy centers. How do people even recognize when disinformation is being used? Because there's just this incredible proliferation of information. Yeah. How do we discern what's real and true and accurate from that which isn't?
Yeah, that's a huge question. I think all of us are familiar with the idea of misinformation and disinformation today. And one of the women in my film, she was a victim of misinformation, and she was led astray by a crisis pregnancy center, which then pushed her into later pregnancy because of the barriers that she came up against. And, you know, one of the things that people, and I include this information in the film, one of the things that people need to know about when it comes to clinics specifically, crisis pregnancy centers and fake clinics outnumber actual reproductive healthcare and abortion clinics, something like 10 to 1. They are often not medically licensed clinics. They are often run by religious or anti-choice organizations and people. They dress up like doctors. They put on a white lab coat. They can buy ultrasound equipment. They do free pregnancy tests, but they don't give the comprehensive reproductive healthcare that you expect when you go into a medical facility. But there's not a lot of general information about these clinics. There is now, because people are recognizing, and there are some wonderful organizations really exposing them for what they do. Exposefakeclinics.com is a really great website and a really great resource for that specifically. But another way disinformation is really, really rampant and frankly terrifying is the way that it becomes just mainstream narrative, and then that becomes legislation, and then that becomes words that licensed doctors have to then tell patients, even though it's medically inaccurate. And let me give you an example. So people may have heard about this idea of abortion reversal, which is bogus. It's not based in science at all. And it was an anti-choice doctor, I believe he's based in California, but he basically did a study which was not peer-reviewed. He did a study and he tried to experiment on pregnant people, which already is completely gross in itself. But what he wanted to try and prove was that with medication abortion, which is a series of pills, if after the first pill you don't want to go ahead with the abortion, you can reverse it by taking something else instead of the rest of the medication abortion. But what he's doing is not reversing the abortion. All you're doing is taking the first pill and not taking the rest, and the abortion doesn't end up happening. But what he did was create this peer-reviewed study, which is not peer-reviewed. He distributed to a lot of anti-abortion networks and news outlets who have millions and millions of followers. It gets proliferated on social media and in a lot of conservative news platforms and websites. Then that becomes boilerplate legislation, which is handed to state legislatures and legislators. They use this bogus information to now mandate doctors to counsel patients, hey, did you know, even though you want an abortion, you can now reverse your abortion if you have regrets, which is not based in medical science. The American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists do not recommend it. There are actual institutions, medical institutions, that are warning against stuff like this. But because the narrative has been set, because you know, we didn't get ahead of this information, now it's out there, now it's legislation, now doctors are having to read these scripts and potentially harm patients, give them the wrong information. Those are the kind of tactics that we're up against. So I think one of the things that we can do to discern whether it's false or true is look at the source. You know, where does it, when you're reading an article and it says a study said, is there a link to the study? And if there is a link to the study, click on it. Who are the people writing the study? You can research it. Everything is available online. Who are the people writing this study? What is the institute putting this study out? You know, they've created their own institutions. There's one called the Charlotte Loza Institute, which is not a peer-reviewed medical institution that is recognized by actual medical institutions. And so they're able to put out these reviews and studies and say, well, this is from an institute, so it must be true. And, you know, it's really, really sad and scary, the level that they will go to put abortion misinformation out there. And then, you know, at election time, that gets repeated by politicians, by people moderating debates without even realizing that the words that they're using are spreading misinformation. So when they ask a question like, oh, you know, for instance, Bernie Sanders, and he did get asked about this, what are your thoughts on late-term abortion? Late-term abortion is not a medically accurate term at all. Right. And this is something that's in my film. When you are late term, you are 40 weeks and beyond. It actually has nothing to do with abortion. But a lot of politicians, including the pro-choice ones, don't push back on that term because maybe there's not enough information out there or they're not being prepped in the right way. But there really needs to be a pushing back of just even the very words that are being used in mainstream media, because that is causing so much harm, even to the point where I've had conversations with pro-choice people recently who will say, oh yeah, I'm pro-choice, but not in the 9th month. And I'm just like, who do you think is getting abortion in the 9th month just because they feel like it? And that is all because of disinformation, misinformation, harmful narratives that are out there that, you know, many people in the pro-choice community aren't pushing back on enough. So I know that was a very long, complex answer, but you know, there are definitely things that we can do. And a lot of it is looking to the source and really doing our research and being mindful of what we say as well.
And I appreciate what you were saying, a study, because that often signals if there is only one study to suspect that. But if the study is and if it's not, if a link is not provided for that study, to question that, because that signals something.
Yeah.
And if the link is there, really see who it is that's producing that study, and are there other institutions that are endorsing, supporting, affirming what's in that study. And you know, you were talking earlier about intersectionality of issues, the economic, et cetera, et cetera. There's one issue that is very intersectional in my way of thinking, and that is public education. That so many people have been socialized through a public education system or through a Christian religious school and program, not to ask the questions that we really need to ask. And so I'm encouraging everyone listening to this, you know, look at what a study means, dive into that, do your own research, and really think about what kinds of ways have you been educated in your own public education system or other system, and how are younger people today being educated? Are people being encouraged to ask questions or not? Any system that dissuades people from asking questions is problematic. That's this
very authoritarian.
Yeah, it is very, very authoritarian. And so you were talking earlier about pushback. We have been socialized, even some of our legislators who identify as pro-choice have been socialized not to ask the next question and not to push back or challenge their colleagues. And so then lots of legislation goes through, not necessarily because the majority of the legislators were really in support of it, but we're in this era where bullying has become very much, you know, legislative bullying has become very much the norm. In someone you know, is there any conversation about the intersection of religion and politics?
So one of the things that I really wanted to focus on with someone you know was not bringing too much political information, except where it's relevant in these women's stories, because there is so much deferring to politics and religion and news. I really wanted people to see these stories in all of their complexity and how they wanted to share their experiences. And where it's relevant there, I put up, you know, fact slides about crisis pregnancy centers and the laws in Texas and, you know, the laws in Honduras, where one of my protagonists, Sharon, came from, and the Catholic hospitals where Mindy became a victim of all these laws that prevented her from getting a life-saving surgery earlier on in her pregnancy, as opposed to nearly hemorrhaging to death later in her pregnancy. So it really is about putting the politics and religious influence into context of a real life story, because it's easy to center the religion, easy to center the politics, but at the end of the day, these stories have to be centered. You know, there is no one who is a greater expert of abortion than someone who has an abortion. You know, we like to put medical practitioners and politicians and activists, and yes, they have expertise, but the people who are experts on their experience are them, and each experience is so different. And so if I can do my part in making sure that people see these are the women that you should be listening to about their experiences, no one else was feeling what they were feeling, you know, inside their bodies as they were going through what they were going through, and listening to them as the experts, I think that could be hopefully a way to push back on this idea that, oh, we need to talk down to women and you need time to think about your decision. So we're going to put a 72-hour waiting period in this state, and we're going to mandate counseling for you because you haven't thought about your decision enough, dear little lady. And it goes back to the idea of reproductive dignity. Like, are we giving people the dignity to know that they know what is best for their lives and their families and their bodies? And so that's what I hope by centering the stories rather than just the politics. But you do get a sense of, you know, Sharon, both Sharon and Valerie had to fly out of Texas. And so you get some idea of what the laws were in Texas at the time, where we're at now. And Mindy was in Illinois, and she had to go to Iowa 3 hours away. So you do get a little sense of the politics that they came up against. And it also shows the real life, everyday impact of these anti-abortion laws in their story. So I think that's the best way that I could explain, you know, how politics plays a role in these decisions.
So speaking of stories and the power of stories, Margarita, we're glad to read that two of your students are in your Women and the Bible class are writing their final projects, looking at the stories of women in the Bible, because the Bible is filled with stories that often of women that are often not lifted up. We hear the stories about men. And so Margarita, whatever you're doing that encourage the students to do that, thanks and blessings to you for that.
Super interesting.
So for individuals who have experienced medical challenge from having abortions, because one person has talked about how the abortion was done in her country, left her with some hormonal change that impacted her voice. And a deeper voice as a result of that. And, you know, there's a part of me that even wonders, was that done on purpose, you know, impacting some hormonal change, almost as a scarlet, you know, a stigma on the person. But for people who have been experiencing shaming or have experienced medical challenge as a result of abortion, is there particular insight or encouragement you have to bring to them?
Well, I think it's really important to share our stories and for more people to listen and to validate their experiences. I mean, there are people that have had adverse medical effects, ongoing effects because of a number of different procedures. And I will say this, you know, when you look at the data globally, the countries where abortion becomes more and more illegal, you start to see more and more really negative medical impacts on women. And that's when you start to see more deaths. And so in countries like, at least here in America, while it is still legal in all 50 states, it is a very, very regulated procedure. And there are studies to show that abortion is extremely safe, safer than getting your tooth removed or some, like some dental procedures and other types of procedures, even more safer than childbirth in a lot of ways, because we have one of the highest rates of maternal mortality in the industrialized world. And again, 50% of those are preventable. So I think it really is about listening to these people sharing their stories and allowing them to be the experts in what they've gone through, and a real examination of what's happening in our medical system. And then there is a lot that needs to be changed and overhauled. But if there is a way that I can encourage people who want to share their story, is that I hope you don't give up speaking up if that is the right thing for you to do, and you do share and you find people who support you, because there are networks out there. There are a number of pro-choice organizations who will uplift your stories and give you support, and and help bring you into the fold where you feel included and validated. And that's really, really important. I think there's such a power in storytelling, because you can, especially in this age of disinformation and misinformation, you can dispute studies and data and statistics all you want and show a different angle and yada, yada, yada. But when someone looks at you and tells you their story, what are you going to do? Dispute that? You can't tell them that they're wrong for what they went through. It's the only thing that we really should be doing is learning and listening, and hopefully becoming more educated in the need to support people in their experiences, whether it's reproductive experiences or beyond. But, specifically in this area, we want to hear, I think the more nuance we hear, the better, because it is easy to put abortion into this binary either or, and I don't even like to use the term pro-life, because like someone said in the chat, the term, Sarah said that the anti-abortion movement has co-opted and monopolized the term pro-life, but it's really, really inaccurate. But because they've used that and they've set the narrative, they've been able to run with it. But a lot of what is happening in the movement is not supporting life at all. They're not speaking about the maternal mortality crisis. They're not speaking about child poverty and the cuts to Medicare. And so it really is about pushing back on these narratives with individual stories. And storytelling is such a powerful medium. One of the women in my film, her name is Renee Bracey Sherman. She's the founder and executive director of We Testify, which is an abortion storytelling and advocacy organization. She has had an abortion herself, and she talks about it a lot. She recently was outside the steps of the Supreme Court talking about her experience. And one of the things she says is that we, talking about people like her who have had abortions, we get to counter the abortion splaining, she calls it, by sharing our stories. And abortion story sharing and storytelling really is pushing back on the decades of misinformation that the pro-life movement has been able to co-opt and take up all the oxygen in the room with everything that they wanted to say. And part of that is because too many pro-choice leaders were too afraid to speak up and rock the boat, or even use the word abortion. I mean, President Joe Biden is considered a pro-choice Catholic, but he has yet to say the word abortion in any State of the Union or in any statement, written or spoken. And so, those things have an impact, but yet any person on the anti-choice side, they'll say the abortion 10 times a day, every day. So
yes,
I think,
yes,
the more that we can share stories, use that word, and really listen to others who have been through these experiences, who want to speak up and help us understand the nuance of these abortion decision-making processes is important.
And to call people out, as you were saying, and Donna, thank you for pro-birth is really the issue, and pro-natalist. But interestingly, as pro-natalist in orientation as the Jewish community is, and in Israel in particular, very pro-natalist in orientation, such that individuals who deal with infertility challenge in Israel are given healthcare support for them to be able to conceive and carry to term. But that's pronatalism is its own thing. Then what do? and to talk as much as possible about all the intersecting issues of what it means to be pregnant, intersecting issues of what it means to parent, et cetera, et cetera. It's absolutely critical. So if we're going to talk about life, what you were saying earlier, Asha, about 60% of women who seek abortions already have at least one child. So not saying people are anti-life, but then that goes back to, I get excited about these conversations because they're so important, but that goes back to the issue of the co-opting of and the misinformation that's been involved in personhood. And so many people, I believe, become quieter about the issue of abortion per se, even though they believe in choice, because they've made this separation. I believe in choice because I believe in compassion. I believe people should have the right to make decisions about their own bodies, da, 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 da. But because many have believed the disinformation and misinformation about what fetal life is, that many people, even if they regard themselves as pro-choice, question, well, isn't abortion murder? And so how do you speak to that issue, Asha? And that's the last question for today.
I mean, a lot
that
of it
easy, that easy question.
It's an easy question about fetal personhood. I'll explain it all. Well, I think it goes back to that idea of who's setting the narrative, who has been the loudest voice in the room for decades, setting the narrative, using certain words and phrases that become collective mainstream terms that now even people like us who are pro-choice are like, yeah, I don't want to say the A word or saying this because I don't want, I'll just say reproductive rights, which is a valid term and it's important, but we're not just talking about all reproductive rights. We're specifically talking about abortion access. And I think, sure, not everyone is comfortable using the word, but we also have to ask ourselves why. What is the culture surrounding the word abortion that has been allowed to dominate for so long that makes us fearful of the word? Because ultimately, it is a healthcare procedure. It is a personal decision, and it should remain so. But here we are, where we are today. And even the term, someone mentioned the term pro-birth or forced birth. I think forced is probably more accurate because they're not pro-birth in the way that they are tackling the maternal mortality crisis. Not at all. There's not a peep out of them for that. So I don't even think they want to protect women in that procedure of giving birth. And which is why I think we really need to be putting the reproductive justice movement front and center. The reproductive justice movement has been around since the early 90s, and they formed a group of Black women leaders, decided that reproductive justice had to go beyond the pro-choice rhetoric that was around at the time. And they realized it wasn't just about access to birth control or abortion. It was about who has the right and dignity and freedom to have children or not, and to do so with safety. That really sums up that it's more than just the right to an abortion. It's a right to have your family the way that you decide is best for you, in safety and in community and with support. And so I think that idea of justice is really important. So I'm not sure if I answered the question. Well, you asked about fetal personhood. Well, I mean, that's a whole other area that I know you have more expertise on because you've been doing these courses on, but it's just another tactic that they're using to strip away the idea of reproductive dignity and freedom by finding different loopholes, different issues. Because once you say, okay, a fetus has the same equal rights as everyone else under the Constitution. By the way, women are not mentioned in the Constitution. So giving that to a fetus is, you have to take that away from the pregnant person. There is no way that you can have both. It's just not possible because of the way biology is. And so for me, looking at it as someone who's just a filmmaker and just an advocate, it really comes back to dignity. Well, the best way that I can ensure that people can live in safety and dignity and have the choices that they make as supported is by giving that dignity to the pregnant person to make the best decision for themselves.
Awesome. So we've come to time. There's a question here for you. You are awesome at communicating. That's said to you. But then the question: do you have good comebacks for strategies in combating billboard misinformation? So that's a biggie. And gosh, we're going to hold that question because we're going to, unless you think you can answer that.
I'll have a think about that for a minute.
Okay, so while you're thinking about that, I'm going to respond a little more about the fetal life issue. There is a course within the Learning Center, one of our online courses that's specifically on fetal life and personhood. I encourage as many of you to take that as possible and really get information about where the idea of fetal personhood, understand how it originated, and how the idea of abortion as murder, how that originated. It's important to understand some of the history of that so that we disrupt this, take away the personhood of any individual who's pregnant. That's unacceptable. But we've got to, and I think many of us would agree that's unacceptable, but understand how that was manufactured, what was the misinformation and the disinformation to set that in motion. All of it centering around this cultural control of the bodies of pregnant women or the bodies of female identified individuals writ large, the control of certain bodies in this culture. Now, Asha, have I given you time to think about that question about billboards?
Yes, I do. I will answer that. And I also want to mention that Sarah mentioned it too. Every faith tradition has, differing views about fetal life, personhood, and ensoulment, and all of that. And so that's often not taken into account in pieces of legislation. It's usually the white hegemonic conservative Christian views that are dominating in our state as well as federal legislatures. So that's really important to recognize that everyone comes to their faith, or if they are religious, in a different way. And so that needs to be, that's why it needs to be a personal decision, definitely. So in terms of the billboard thing, well, I know there are parts of the country where billboards are, they're loud and they're very front and center. There have been some pro-choice organizations who are doing their own billboards. But one thing that's really become even more effective than a lot of physical billboards is social media and geo-targeting in advertisements. And that's another tactic of misinformation that a lot of fake clinics and anti-choice organizations are using. They will geo-target people who are in proximity to reproductive healthcare and abortion clinics, and they will try to pop up ads about choose life and come to this crisis pregnancy center instead. And so they're really weaponizing digital and social media in that regard. So I think the best way that we as individuals who can push back on billboards like that is sharing articles, sharing our stories, sharing posts that Religious Coalition for Reproductive Choice share on Facebook and Instagram, and all different things like that. But digital media really is the I would say the number one way of communicating information to people, especially around political issues. So if there's a way to utilize your digital space, I would say do that. And if there's a way for any organization that you're involved in to become more vocal in the digital space, and maybe if they can afford their own billboards, encourage them to put money toward their own billboards and their own signs, and encouraging people to find out more information about the truth. I think that is another way that we can push back on this. And I also want to say something about the pushing back on the abortion is murder rhetoric. And I had a conversation with someone on Facebook, a woman from my former church, and I posted an article about abortion, and I was having a conversation with someone back and forth, and it was very nuanced, and it was compassionate and positive. And this woman wrote back, abortion is murder. That was it. And it just got me so angry because it was just repeating those slogans and those sayings that we are taught. And so I decided, at first I was going to ignore it. And then I decided, okay, well, who are you calling a murderer? The woman making that decision. Well, now you want to send her to prison because murder is a criminal offense. So you want to send her to prison, and we have the largest prison population on the planet in the United States. So you want to send her to an overcrowded system. Okay, great, noted. Not only that, but the fastest growing demographic of people in the US prisons are women. And guess which women disproportionately are overrepresented in our prisons? Black and brown and low-income women. So once I put all that in a very long venting paragraph to her, she wrote back, oh, sorry, I'm just not thinking clearly, or something like that. And so it just made me feel good that instead of them just throwing out these phrases and us not pushing back, there is a way that we can push back and like, what do you mean by murderer? Who are you calling a murderer? And what is your eventual consequence for her by calling her a murderer? And we're seeing it now with these bills in Texas, like you can sue someone who's having an abortion, and you can be a bounty hunter. And it's just, it's really scary to think. So hopefully those are some suggestions that people can take on board and perhaps implement in their advocacy.
Awesome. Letitia James in New York had a billboard taken down. Absolutely. And we need to really lift up false advertising. We're so focused on wanting to make sure there's freedom of speech till we often don't push back on false advertising, and we need to do that. Thank you for this conversation. Thank you. Oh, one question. When, where, and how can people access someone you know?
Yeah, so the film is being edited right now. I'm working with an amazing editor. I'm also, a lot of it's going to be animated. A lot of the retelling of the abortion stories are going to be retold through animation sequences. I'm working with a wonderful Brazilian animator called Marcita. She's wonderful. And so I'm hoping later this year. I don't have an exact date, but in the meantime, I am raising funds, applying for grants so that I can finish the film, and obviously doing webinars like this so I can raise awareness about it. I do have a fiscal sponsor in Film Independent, so anyone can donate and make a tax deductible donation. I will put the link in the chat right now. That gives you a little bit of information about the film, about the crew that I'm working with, a little bit about the story. I will have poster art done in the next month or so. I'm working with an amazing illustrator out of New York. She's putting together some poster design right now. And so it's all coming together. But if you can keep in touch with me via my website, ashadahya.com, or you can check out the fiscal sponsorship page. And thank you to everyone who has donated so far. I'm very, very thankful and honored for your donation to help bring these stories to life and put them out there in the world.
Asha Dahya, thank you, wonderful woman, for doing the work that you're doing and for having the courage to keep dealing with the ugliness that comes your way. Continue to take care of yourself, that you are whole and strong and living in peace, so that you might continue to help tell the stories of those who